The morning sun cast long shadows across Fairfield Air Base when Senior Airman Ella Johnson watched Colonel Marcus Harrison climb out of his F-22 Raptor and do something that would change military aviation forever. He looked directly at the 23-year-old aircraft maintenance specialist and said, "Your turn." What happened next shattered every assumption about who belonged in the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter jet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wrench slipped from Ella's grease-stained fingers as she heard the familiar whine of the F-22's engine spooling down on the tarmac. 630 hours at Fairfield Air Base meant the morning flight operations were wrapping up, and she had exactly 45 minutes to complete her post-flight inspection before the next sortie launched. The Nevada sun was already promising another scorching day, but inside Hangar 7, the concrete floors remained blessedly cool. Ella Johnson had been performing aircraft maintenance for 18 months, and every morning followed the same precise ritual: check hydraulic fluid levels, inspect control surfaces for wear, document any anomalies in the maintenance log, test avionics systems, sign off on airworthiness certificates. It was methodical, critical work that kept $60 million aircraft and their pilots alive. But it was also invisible work that nobody celebrated. At 5'4", with auburn hair perpetually pulled back in regulation braids, Ella moved through her tasks with an efficiency that had earned her recognition from her immediate supervisors but remained largely unnoticed by the flight crews. The pilots acknowledged her with polite nods when they pre-flighted their aircraft, occasionally asking technical questions about system status, but she was part of the machinery that supported their missions rather than a person with aspirations of her own. Her European accent, a remnant from her childhood in rural Ireland before her family immigrated to the United States, sometimes drew curious glances from new personnel. But most of the base had grown accustomed to her soft, precise way of speaking. She'd learned to modulate her voice to project authority when discussing technical specifications, though she noticed that her recommendations carried more weight when delivered through her supervisor, Technical Sergeant Williams, than when she presented them directly. The F-22 Raptor represented the pinnacle of American air superiority technology, and Ella knew every inch of its revolutionary design. She understood the intricacies of its thrust vectoring nozzles, could diagnose problems with its advanced radar systems, and had memorized the specifications for its stealth coating. While other maintenance personnel focused on their specific specialties, Ella had quietly expanded her knowledge to encompass every system on the aircraft. During her off-duty hours, she studied pilot training manuals that she'd borrowed from the base library. She'd memorized emergency procedures, flight characteristics, and operational limitations. She understood the aerodynamic principles that allowed the Raptor to perform maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. But this knowledge remained her secret, filed away as intellectual curiosity rather than practical ambition. The pilots who flew these machines were an elite brotherhood, graduates of the Air Force Academy or prestigious ROTC programs, holders of advanced degrees and recipients of extensive flight training. They possessed security clearances that Ella could never hope to obtain and social connections that opened doors throughout the military hierarchy. She respected their skills and dedication, but she also recognized the insurmountable barriers that separated her world from theirs. Her maintenance bay was organized with a precision that reflected both her personality and her Irish upbringing. Tools arranged by size and function, technical manuals sorted by aircraft system, spare parts inventoried and logged with obsessive attention to detail. Her supervisor had stopped checking her work months ago, trusting her thoroughness and accuracy. Implicitly, she took pride in never having signed off on an aircraft that subsequently experienced mechanical problems. As she completed her morning inspection of Raptor 064108, Ella paused to run her hand along the aircraft's wing. The composite materials felt warm from the morning sun, and she could sense the potential energy contained within the sleek airframe. This machine could climb at 50,000 feet per minute, reach speeds exceeding Mach 2, and turn inside any adversary aircraft in the world. She wondered what it would feel like to harness that power, to feel the acceleration pressing her back into the ejection seat as the afterburners ignited. But such thoughts were fantasy, and Ella Johnson dealt in reality. Her reality was hydraulic. Fluid samples and tire pressure checks, systems diagnostics and paperwork. She was 23 years old, technically proficient, and completely invisible to the people who made decisions about who deserved opportunities to fly. The radio in her maintenance bay crackled with tower communications as the next wave of pilots prepared for departure. Soon, the hangar would fill with the thunder of engines and the controlled chaos of flight operations. Ella would watch from the ground, as she always did, ensuring that others could touch the sky while she remained earthbound by circumstance and regulation. The pilot's briefing room hummed with the confident energy of men who commanded the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Ella entered quietly, carrying her maintenance clipboard and keeping her eyes focused on her paperwork as she took a seat in the back row. These meetings were technically open to all personnel involved in flight operations, but the unspoken understanding was that maintenance staff attended to provide technical support, not to contribute to tactical discussions. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, his silver hair and lined face reflecting 20 years of flying experience. Behind him, a large display showed weather patterns, threat assessments, and training scenarios for the day's sorties. The assembled pilots, all male, all officers, all carrying themselves with the casual confidence that came from mastering one of humanity's most challenging professions, listened attentively as he outlined the morning's objectives. Today's exercise focuses on beyond visual range intercepts, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. We'll be working against simulated threats approaching from multiple vectors. The key is maintaining situational awareness while managing your radar signatures. Captain Derek Morrison, a recent graduate of the Fighter Weapons School, raised his hand. Sir, what's the fuel consideration for extended supersonic flight? The manual specs seem conservative compared to what we've been experiencing. Harrison nodded approvingly. Good question. The real-world consumption varies based on altitude, atmospheric conditions, and pilot technique. Our maintenance teams can provide more specific data on engine performance. All eyes turned toward Ella, and she felt the familiar mixture of opportunity and dismissal. She cleared her throat and consulted her notes. The JP-8 consumption rate increases approximately 15% during sustained supersonic flight due to afterburner efficiency curves. However, at Angels 40 and above, you can expect nearly optimal fuel economy, even with periodic afterburner use. Morrison looked skeptical. How would maintenance know about supersonic flight characteristics? That's operational data. The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Ella felt heat rise in her cheeks as 20 pairs of eyes evaluated her credentials to speak about flight performance. Her technical knowledge was extensive, but her lack of flight experience made her an outsider commenting on matters beyond her supposed expertise. I review all post-flight reports and correlate fuel consumption with flight profiles, she replied evenly. The data shows consistent patterns across different pilot techniques and mission profiles. Data is one thing, Lieutenant Parker interjected, with a condescending smile. Understanding what it means in the cockpit is something else entirely. You can read about G-forces all day long, but until you've pulled 9 Gs in a turning fight, you don't really understand the limitations. Several pilots chuckled, and Ella felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her role rather than respected for her knowledge. She'd memorized every performance chart, studied every flight manual, and analyzed thousands of hours of operational data, But her insights were dismissed because she'd never sat in the pilot's seat. Colonel Harrison raised a hand for silence. "Let's keep this professional. Airman Johnson provides excellent technical support, and her data analysis has been valuable for maintenance planning." The words were meant to be supportive, but they also reinforced her limitations. Technical support, maintenance planning. Not flight operations, not tactical knowledge, not the kind of expertise that mattered when aircraft were screaming through the sky at twice the speed of sound. After the briefing, Ella lingered in the hallway as the pilots filed past, discussing the morning's missions with easy camaraderie. She caught fragments of conversation that highlighted her outsider status. "Can you imagine if they started letting maintenance troops into the cockpit?" Morrison was saying to his wingmen. "I mean, no offense to Johnson, but there's a reason why pilot training takes 2 years. You can't learn to fly a Raptor from a technical manual." "She's sharp, though," Parker replied. "Probably knows the aircraft systems better than most of us. But knowing how something works and knowing how to use it in combat are completely different things." "Exactly. I wouldn't trust someone without flight training to handle my aircraft in an emergency, no matter how well they understand the technical specs." Ella pretended to review her paperwork as they passed, but their words reinforced what she'd always known. Her knowledge was respected only within the narrow confines of her assigned role. She could diagnose complex mechanical problems, optimize performance parameters, and ensure that aircraft met the highest safety standards. But she would never be considered qualified to actually fly the machines, she maintained. The limitation wasn't just regulatory, it was cultural. The Air Force pilot community was an exclusive fraternity that protected its boundaries through a combination of formal requirements and informal social barriers. Flight training programs selected candidates based on educational credentials, security clearances, and leadership potential that Ella would never possess. Her Irish working-class background, her enlisted rank, and her gender all marked her as someone who belonged in support roles rather than command positions. As she walked back to her maintenance bay, Ella reflected on the conversation she'd had with her father during her last leave. Patrick Johnson had spent 30 years as an aircraft mechanic for Aer Lingus, and he'd taught his daughter that competence earned respect regardless of title or position. But the military operated under different rules, where respect flowed downward through rigid hierarchies and opportunities were distributed based on credentials rather than capability. She'd learned to accept these limitations to find satisfaction in her technical achievements and professional competence. But acceptance didn't eliminate the quiet frustration that built each time her insights were dismissed or her capabilities were reduced to her rank and role. She was 23 years old, intellectually curious, and increasingly aware that her potential was being constrained by other people's assumptions about what she was qualified to achieve. The morning sun climbed higher over Fairfield Air Base as Ella returned to her routine duties, carrying with her the latest reminder that excellence within limitations was still just limitation. 3 weeks had passed since the briefing room incident, and Ella noticed how conversations shifted when she approached. The pilots' informal discussions about flight characteristics and tactical scenarios would pause when she entered their vicinity, resuming only after she'd moved on to her maintenance duties. It wasn't malicious, but it was exclusionary in a way that made her increasingly aware of her outsider status. The pattern became most obvious during the monthly aircraft systems review, where maintenance personnel presented their findings to the flight operations staff. Ella had discovered a correlation between tire pressure variations and landing gear stress that could potentially extend component life by 20%. Her analysis was thorough, backed by 6 months of data collection, and could save the Air Force significant maintenance costs. Technical. Sergeant Williams delivered her presentation to the assembled officers, reading directly from her written report while she stood silently beside him. The data was compelling, the recommendations were practical, and the potential savings were substantial. But when questions arose about implementation details, Williams deferred to his team's analysis, rather than allowing Ella to explain her work directly. "This is solid work, Williams," Colonel Harrison commented, reviewing the charts and graphs that Ella had prepared. "Your maintenance division continues to exceed expectations in analytical support." "Thank you, sir. My team takes pride in thorough documentation and systematic analysis." Ella watched her work being credited to her supervisor while she remained invisible in the background. Williams wasn't malicious. He simply operated within a system where enlisted personnel presented their findings through the proper chain of command. But the effect was the same. Her expertise was acknowledged while her identity remained hidden. After the meeting, Captain Morrison approached Williams with follow-up questions about the tire pressure analysis. "This kind of detailed performance correlation is impressive. Which of your technicians has the background to do this level of statistical analysis?" Williams glanced at Ella, then back at Morrison. "Several of our people have strong technical backgrounds. It's really a team effort." Morrison nodded and walked away, never making the connection between the analysis he'd praised and the maintenance specialist he'd dismissed 3 weeks earlier. Ella felt a familiar mixture of pride in her work and frustration at her invisibility. The dismissal extended beyond formal briefings into everyday interactions. When pilots encountered mechanical issues, they discussed symptoms and potential solutions with Williams or other senior maintenance personnel, rarely engaging directly with the technicians who would actually perform the repairs. Ella's diagnostic skills were utilized through intermediaries, her recommendations filtered through supervisors who received credit for her insights. During lunch breaks, she often sat alone while the pilots gathered at their traditional table, discussing flying experiences that she could only imagine. Their conversations covered everything from combat training exercises to civilian flying adventures, creating a shared cultural reference point that excluded anyone who hadn't spent time in a cockpit. Lieutenant Parker was regaling his audience with a story about a particularly challenging formation flight exercise. "The weather deteriorated faster than forecast, and we had to navigate through cloud layers with minimal visibility. The key was trusting your instruments and maintaining precise formation positioning." Ella listened from her nearby table, understanding the technical challenges he described better than he might expect. She'd studied instrument navigation procedures extensively and could visualize the flight dynamics he was describing. But her knowledge remained theoretical, lacking the experiential validation that came from actually executing those procedures under pressure. "Formation flying is 90% trust," Morrison added. "You have to know that your wingman understands the aircraft's capabilities as well as you do. One mistake at 300 knots can kill both of you." The comment highlighted the fundamental barrier that separated Ella from their world. Pilot training wasn't just about learning to fly. It was about developing the judgment and reflexes necessary to make life or death decisions in high-stress environments. Her technical knowledge was extensive, but it hadn't been tested under the extreme conditions that defined military aviation. As she returned to her maintenance bay, Ella reflected on the circular nature of her situation. She was denied opportunities to prove her capabilities because she lacked experience, but she couldn't gain experience without being given opportunities. The system was designed to maintain its existing hierarchies, rewarding those who already possessed the credentials necessary for advancement. Her Irish mother had often told her that patience and persistence would eventually overcome obstacles. But military culture operated under different rules than civilian life. Merit alone wasn't sufficient. Advancement required navigating complex social and institutional barriers that often had little to do with actual competence. The afternoon brought another reminder of her limitations when a visiting general toured the maintenance facilities. Williams presented their division's achievements while Ella and her colleague stood at attention beside their workstations. The general praised the unit's efficiency and technical expertise, shaking hands with supervisors while barely acknowledging the enlisted personnel who performed the actual work. As the tour group moved on, Ella returned to her diagnostic computer and pulled up the flight data from the morning sorties. Every maneuver, every system activation, every performance parameter was recorded in digital detail. She could analyze this data better than most pilots could interpret it, but her insights would remain confined to maintenance reports that few people would read and fewer would remember. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert when Ella completed her shift, her comprehensive understanding of F-22 systems unchanged, her position in the Air Force hierarchy equally static. The base library was nearly empty at 2,100 hours when Ella settled into her usual corner table with a stack of flight manuals and technical publications. Most personnel were either asleep or socializing in the recreation areas, but she'd discovered that the evening hours provided uninterrupted time for the studying that had become her secret obsession. Her official duties ended at 1700, but her real education began when she could explore beyond the narrow confines of maintenance procedures. Tonight's reading material included the F-22 Pilot's Operating Handbook, Emergency Procedures Checklist, and a tactical manual on air-to-air combat employment. These documents were classified at levels that required careful handling, but they were available to anyone with appropriate security clearances and legitimate research purposes. Ella had obtained access by volunteering to update maintenance training materials, a project that required understanding how pilot procedures related to ground support operations. Williams had approved her request without much consideration, viewing it as commendable initiative that would improve her department's effectiveness. He didn't know that she was memorizing every flight procedure, every emergency protocol, every performance limitation described in the manuals. The F-22's flight control system fascinated her most. Unlike older aircraft that required constant pilot input to maintain stable flight, the Raptor employed a sophisticated computer system that interpreted pilot intentions and translated them into precise control surface movements. The pilot didn't fly the aircraft directly. Instead, they communicated their desired flight path to a computer that managed the complex aerodynamics necessary to achieve those intentions. She studied the control interfaces, memorizing the function of every switch, button, and display. The heads-up display projected critical flight information onto the pilot's visor, allowing them to monitor airspeed, altitude, and weapon status without looking away from their target. The multifunction displays provided detailed system status information and tactical data that required split-second interpretation under combat conditions. Emergency procedures received particular attention in her studies. Engine failures, hydraulic system malfunctions, electrical problems, and combat damage scenarios all required specific responses that could mean the difference between successful recovery and catastrophic loss. She memorized the decision trees that guided pilots through crisis situations, understanding the logic behind each procedural step. Her notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams and carefully transcribed procedures. She sketched the cockpit layout from memory, labeling every control and display. She created flowcharts for emergency situations, condensing complex procedures into visual references that could be quickly consulted under stress. Her Irish grandmother had taught her that detailed preparation was the foundation of all success, and Ella applied that philosophy to her aviation studies with religious dedication. The tactical manuals revealed the strategic thinking behind air-to-air combat operations. Beyond visual range engagements relied on sophisticated radar systems and long-range missiles that could engage targets at distances exceeding 50 miles. Within visual range combat required understanding energy management, turning performance, and weapons employment in dynamic three-dimensional battles that unfolded at supersonic speeds. She learned about threat assessment, target prioritization, and engagement geometry. Modern air combat wasn't the romantic dogfighting portrayed in movies. It was a highly technical discipline that required instant recognition of tactical situations and precise execution of complex procedures. Pilots needed to manage multiple information sources simultaneously while making decisions that could determine mission success or failure. Her technical background provided advantages that she hadn't initially recognized. Understanding the aircraft systems allowed her to comprehend how pilot inputs translated into aircraft performance. She could visualize the relationship between throttle settings and thrust output, between control stick movement and aerodynamic forces, between tactical decisions and fuel consumption rates. During her lunch breaks, she practiced visualizing flight scenarios in her head. She would imagine takeoff procedures, running through the checklist items and emergency considerations that pilots faced during every departure. She visualized formation flights, instrument approaches, and combat engagements, testing her understanding of procedures against hypothetical situations that might arise during actual operations. The flight simulator software on her personal laptop became another training tool. While the civilian versions couldn't replicate classified systems or weapons employment procedures, they provided valuable experience with basic flight dynamics and navigation challenges. She practiced instrument approaches during simulated weather conditions, learning to interpret navigation displays and maintain precise flight paths without visual references. Her colleagues would have been surprised to know how she spent her free time. They saw her as a dedicated maintenance technician who took pride in her work, but they had no idea that she was systematically acquiring the knowledge base necessary to operate the aircraft she serviced. Her studies remained private, pursued with the intensity of someone preparing for an examination that might never come. Williams occasionally noticed her extensive reading, but he interpreted it as professional development that made her more effective in her maintenance role. "Johnson's really committed to understanding these systems," he told Colonel Harrison during a routine personnel review. "She asks detailed questions about flight operations that help her anticipate maintenance requirements." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That kind of comprehensive system knowledge is valuable. Maintenance personnel who understand operational requirements can prevent problems before they become flight safety issues." Neither man realized that Ella's studies extended far beyond maintenance applications. She was acquiring the theoretical foundation necessary to actually fly the F-22, even though no one expected her to ever use that knowledge practically. Her preparation was systematic, thorough, and completely invisible to the people who would decide whether she ever received opportunities to apply what she'd learned. As she closed the flight manuals and prepared to return to her quarters, Ella reflected on her strange double life. By day, she was a competent maintenance technician who serviced aircraft for others to fly. By night, she was secretly preparing herself for opportunities that might never arise, driven by a quiet conviction that readiness creates its own possibilities. The abandoned maintenance hangar at the far end of Fairfield Air Base had been scheduled for demolition, but budget cuts had postponed the project indefinitely. Ella discovered that security patrols rarely ventured into the area, making it perfect for her most ambitious preparation project, a full-scale F-22 cockpit mock-up constructed from discarded training materials and salvaged components. Working during her off-duty hours over the course of 6 months, she had assembled a remarkably accurate replica of the Raptor's pilot station. The framework came from a damaged training simulator that had been marked for disposal. The displays were older generation models that she'd requisitioned through maintenance channels, claiming they were needed for technician training purposes. The control interfaces were fabricated using technical drawings and precise measurements taken during her routine maintenance inspections. Every switch, button, and lever was positioned exactly as it appeared in the actual aircraft. The multifunction displays showed realistic system information using software she'd developed during her computer science studies before enlisting. The heads-up display projected flight data onto a piece of specially treated glass that she'd crafted after studying the optical specifications in the technical manuals. Her mock-up couldn't replicate the physical sensations of flight, but it provided an environment where she could practice the complex manual procedures that pilots executed during normal and emergency operations. She could run through pre-flight checks, startup sequences, and system tests with the same precision required in the actual aircraft. Her muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions until her hands could find every control without conscious thought. The emergency procedures received particular attention during her training sessions. Engine failure scenarios, hydraulic system malfunctions, and electrical problems all required specific response patterns that had to be executed quickly and accurately under stress. She practiced these procedures until they became automatic, building the reflexive responses that could save lives during actual emergencies. Navigation exercises occupied many evening hours as she worked through complex instrument approach procedures. Using realistic weather data and airfield information, she would configure her displays to simulate various atmospheric conditions, then practice maintaining precise flight paths using only instrument references. Her understanding of navigation principles expanded from theoretical knowledge to practical application as she learned to interpret multiple information sources simultaneously. Combat scenarios provided the most challenging training opportunities. Using declassified tactical information and publicly available threat assessments, she developed realistic engagement simulations that tested her ability to manage weapons systems while maintaining situational awareness. Air-to-air combat required split-second decision-making based on incomplete information, and she practiced threat assessment and engagement prioritization until her responses became instinctive. Her technical background provided advantages that she exploited systematically. Understanding how radar systems functioned allowed her to comprehend their tactical applications more quickly than pilots who learned to use the equipment without fully understanding its underlying principles. Her knowledge of engine performance characteristics informed her energy management decisions during simulated combat maneuvers. The physical demands of flying couldn't be replicated in her ground-based simulator, but she compensated by developing an intensive fitness program focused on the specific requirements of high-performance aviation. G-force tolerance required exceptional core strength and cardiovascular conditioning. She trained with weights and performed specialized exercises designed to improve her ability to maintain consciousness and manual dexterity under extreme acceleration forces. Spatial orientation skills received particular emphasis in her training regimen. Military pilots needed to maintain precise awareness of their aircraft's position and attitude even when visual references were unavailable or unreliable. She practiced spatial reasoning exercises and used virtual reality equipment to develop the three-dimensional thinking necessary for complex flight maneuvers. Her studies expanded beyond technical procedures to include the tactical doctrine that governed F-22 employment in various mission scenarios. Air superiority operations, ground attack missions, and reconnaissance sorties all required different approaches to flight planning, threat assessment, and mission execution. She memorized the tactical principles that guided pilot decision-making during complex operational environments. The psychological aspects of high-stress flight operations became another area of focused study. Combat pilots needed to maintain optimal performance levels while managing fear, fatigue, and information overload. She researched stress management techniques and practiced mental exercises designed to improve focus and decision-making under pressure. Her notebook collection expanded to include detailed mission planning worksheets, emergency procedure quick reference cards, and tactical employment guides. Every document was meticulously organized and regularly updated as her knowledge base expanded. She created training scenarios for herself, testing her ability to respond appropriately to various situations that might arise during actual flight operations. Williams occasionally noticed her extensive technical documentation, but he attributed it to her methodical approach to maintenance work. "Johnson keeps more detailed records than most officers," he commented to his fellow supervisors. "She really understands these systems at a level that's unusual for enlisted personnel." What Williams didn't know was that Ella's documentation extended far beyond maintenance applications. Her records included complete flight planning procedures, tactical employment guidelines, and emergency response protocols that had nothing to do with ground-based aircraft support. She was preparing herself to operate the F-22 as a pilot, not just to maintain it as a technician. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably more thoroughly prepared for F-22 operations than some of the pilots who flew the aircraft regularly. Her systematic approach to learning had given her comprehensive knowledge of every system and procedure, while her technical background provided deep understanding of the underlying principles that governed aircraft performance. But knowledge alone wasn't sufficient for military aviation. Flight training programs existed to transform theoretical understanding into practical capability under the extreme stresses of high-performance flight. Her preparation was extensive, but it remained untested under the conditions that would ultimately determine her suitability for pilot duties. As she completed another evening training session in her makeshift simulator, Ella wondered whether her extensive preparation would ever find practical application, or whether it would remain an elaborate intellectual exercise pursued in the shadows of her official duties. The whispers started after Ella's unauthorized access to the classified flight training materials was discovered during a routine security audit. She had followed proper procedures for checking out the manuals, but the sheer volume of her research and the scope of her studies raised questions about her intentions that rippled through the base's informal communication networks. "Master," Sergeant Rodriguez from Security Forces knocked on her quarters door at 0630 hours. Carrying a folder marked with classification stamps and wearing the serious expression that accompanied official investigations. "Airman Johnson, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your research activities." Ella invited him in, her heart racing but her voice steady. "What kind of concerns, Sergeant?" Rodriguez consulted his notes. "You've checked out 47 classified publications in the past 8 months, including tactical manuals, emergency procedures, and combat employment guides that fall well outside your assigned duties. Your supervisors want to understand the purpose of this extensive research." "I'm updating maintenance training materials," Ella replied, which was technically true but didn't capture the full scope of her activities. "Understanding pilot procedures helps me anticipate maintenance requirements and improve our support effectiveness." 47 publications for training materials? Rodriguez's skepticism was evident. "That seems excessive for maintenance applications. Some of these documents contain information that has no relevance to ground-based aircraft support." Ella felt the familiar tension that came with defending her capabilities to people who couldn't understand her motivations. "Comprehensive system knowledge makes me more effective in my assigned role. I take pride in thorough preparation." Rodriguez made notes in his folder. "The thing is, Johnson, some people are wondering whether your interests extend beyond maintenance duties. There's been talk about your questions during briefings, your detailed technical knowledge, and now this extensive research into flight operations. It's creating concerns about your focus and priorities." The investigation concluded without formal charges, but its effects lingered like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Ella noticed changes in how her colleagues interacted with her, subtle shifts that suggested her loyalty and professional focus were now subjects of discussion. Her detailed technical questions were met with polite but cautious responses. Her suggestions during briefings were acknowledged but not acted upon with the same enthusiasm as before. Williams called her into his office 3 days after Rodriguez's visit. Johnson, I want to discuss your professional development goals. There's been some feedback that suggests you might be losing focus on your primary responsibilities. My maintenance performance has been consistently excellent, Ella replied. I've never missed a deadline or failed an inspection. That's true, and I appreciate your technical competence. But leadership is concerned about the direction of your interests. The extensive research into flight operations, the detailed questions about pilot procedures, it's creating an impression that you're not satisfied with your assigned role. Ella felt a familiar frustration building. Her dedication to understanding the aircraft she maintained was being interpreted as dissatisfaction with her position rather than commitment to excellence. I believe that thorough system knowledge makes me more effective in supporting flight operations. Williams leaned back in his chair. Look, Johnson, I understand intellectual curiosity, but you need to remember that there are boundaries in military service. Pilots and maintenance personnel have different roles for good reasons. Crossing those boundaries, even intellectually, can create problems for everyone involved. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but its message was clear. Ella's preparation was being viewed as inappropriate ambition rather than professional development. Her supervisors wanted her to limit her studies to maintenance-specific topics and avoid the broader aviation knowledge that had become her passion. Colonel Harrison's weekly staff meeting provided another reminder of her changing status within the unit. When technical questions arose about aircraft performance, Williams answered them himself rather than consulting Ella as he had in the past. Her insights were still valued, but they were filtered through intermediaries who received credit for her expertise. The fuel consumption analysis shows interesting correlations with flight profile variations, Williams reported, reading from Ella's latest research. Our maintenance division believes we can optimize operational efficiency through better coordination between flight planning and ground support procedures. Harrison nodded approvingly. Excellent work, Williams. This kind of analytical support adds real value to our operations. Ella sat silently in the back of the room, watching her work being presented by others while she remained invisible. The irony was painful. Her extensive knowledge of flight operations was valuable enough to influence space policy. But she wasn't considered qualified to discuss that knowledge directly with the people who made decisions. The isolation extended beyond professional interactions into her social life. The few friendships she developed with other enlisted personnel became strained as word spread about her extensive research and the security investigation. Some colleagues viewed her studies as pretentious overreach. Others worried that association with her might affect their own career prospects. During lunch breaks, she increasingly ate alone while observing the easy camaraderie among pilots and the comfortable social hierarchies among her maintenance colleagues. She'd become an outsider in both worlds, too ambitious for her assigned role, but too junior and inexperienced for the flight operations community she studied so intensively. Her Irish father called during one particularly difficult week, and Ella found herself explaining her situation to someone who understood the challenges of being underestimated in technical professions. Competence threatens people sometimes, Patrick Johnson told his daughter. They're more comfortable when everyone stays in their assigned boxes, but boxes are for storage, not for living. The conversation provided perspective, but it didn't change her daily reality. Ella's extensive preparation continued in secret, but it now carried additional risk. Any further security concerns could result in formal disciplinary action or reassignment to duties that would eliminate her access to the aircraft and information she'd grown to love. As she returned to her quarters after another day of careful interactions and guarded conversations, Ella reflected on the price of pursuing knowledge that others considered inappropriate for someone in her position. Her preparation was more comprehensive than ever, but her opportunities to apply that knowledge seemed to be diminishing rather than expanding. The Nevada Sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple as she wondered whether her secret studies would ever lead to anything more than intellectual satisfaction and professional isolation. Colonel Harrison's office felt smaller than usual when Ella was called in for what Williams had described as a career guidance discussion. The walls displayed decades of aviation history, photographs of legendary aircraft, commendation certificates, and squadron patches that told the story of American air power. Ella sat across from Harrison's desk, her service record spread between them like evidence at a trial. "Airman Johnson," Harrison began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering an uncomfortable message. "Your technical competence has never been questioned. Your maintenance record is exemplary, and your analytical contributions have improved our operational efficiency significantly. However, there are concerns about the direction of your professional interests." Ella kept her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. "What kind of concerns, sir?" Harrison picked up a folder marked with security classifications. "Your research activities have raised questions about your focus and priorities. 47 classified publications, extensive studies of flight operations, detailed knowledge of tactical procedures. These activities suggest interests that extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. Sir, understanding pilot procedures helps me provide better maintenance support. My studies have identified several efficiency improvements that have benefited our operations." "That's true, and those contributions are valued. But there's a difference between professional development and—" Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let me be direct, Johnson. Some people believe you're studying these materials because you harbor ambitions that are unrealistic, given your position and qualifications." The words hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Ella felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized that her preparation was being interpreted as evidence of inappropriate ambition rather than professional dedication. "Sir, I study these systems because I want to be the best maintenance technician I can be. Understanding how pilots use the aircraft helps me anticipate problems and provide better support." Harrison leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Johnson, I'm going to speak frankly with you. Military aviation operates under strict hierarchies for good reasons. Pilots undergo years of specialized training, possess advanced security clearances, and demonstrate leadership qualities that prepare them for the responsibilities of flying multi-million-dollar weapon systems. These aren't arbitrary distinctions. They're essential qualifications." Ella felt her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "Sir, I understand the requirements for pilot training. I'm not requesting assignment to flight duties. I'm simply trying to develop a comprehensive understanding of the systems I maintain." "But that's exactly the problem," Harrison replied. "Your level of preparation suggests aspirations that can't be fulfilled through normal career progression. You're an enlisted maintenance technician with a high school education and no officer training. The path to pilot wings isn't available to someone in your position, regardless of your technical knowledge or personal dedication." The statement hit like a physical blow. Ella had known these facts intellectually, but hearing them articulated so directly forced her to confront the reality she'd been avoiding. Her extensive preparation was fundamentally pointless because the system would never provide opportunities to apply what she'd learned. "Sir, what if someone's circumstances change? What if they develop qualifications that weren't initially apparent?" Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Johnson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but military aviation isn't a field where hidden potential suddenly transforms careers. Pilot selection is rigorous, competitive, and limited to candidates who meet specific criteria from the beginning of their service. Outstanding maintenance technicians don't become fighter pilots, no matter how much they study or how dedicated they are." Ella felt years of preparation and hope collapsing under the weight of institutional reality. "So you're saying that my studies are wasted effort?" I'm saying that your studies should focus on advancing your career within maintenance and technical specialties. There are NCO development programs, advanced technical training opportunities, and leadership positions that would benefit from your analytical skills and work ethic. But pursuing knowledge that can't be practically applied is a distraction from achievable goals. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, but Ella barely heard the details. Harrison was essentially ordering her to abandon the preparation that had become her passion, to accept limitations that she'd been systematically working to overcome. Her comprehensive knowledge of F-22 systems was impressive, but ultimately irrelevant because she would never be allowed to use it operationally. I need your commitment that you'll refocus your professional development on areas that align with your assigned duties and realistic career progression, Harrison concluded. The extensive research into flight operations needs to end. It's creating concerns about your priorities and potentially affecting your security clearance eligibility. Ellen nodded curtly, not trusting her voice to remain steady. I understand, sir. Good. Williams speaks highly of your technical abilities, and there are excellent opportunities for advancement within maintenance specialties. Focus on those paths, and you'll have a successful military career. As Ella left Harrison's office, she felt as though she'd been sentenced to intellectual imprisonment. Her extensive preparation was being dismissed as inappropriate ambition, her comprehensive system knowledge reduced to a security concern. The hours she'd spent studying flight procedures, practicing emergency responses, and developing tactical understanding were suddenly worthless because they fell outside her permitted scope of interest. Walking across the base toward her quarters, Ella reflected on the fundamental unfairness of systems that judged people's potential based on their origins rather than their capabilities. Her Irish accent, her enlisted rank, her maintenance background, all of these factors defined what others believed she could achieve. Regardless of what she'd already accomplished through self-directed preparation, the evening sky was clear, and she could see F-22s returning from their training missions. The aircraft she knew intimately would continue flying with pilots who possessed the credentials necessary for their positions, while she would return to her assigned role of ensuring those aircraft remained mechanically sound for others to operate. Secret preparation had been discovered and officially discouraged. The knowledge she'd acquired would remain theoretical, never tested under the conditions that would prove its practical value. She was being told to accept her limitations and focus on achievable goals within the narrow confines of her assigned role. But as she watched the Raptors disappear into their hangars, Ella realized that some preparations couldn't be abandoned simply because others deemed them inappropriate. Her knowledge was real, her skills were developed, and her understanding was comprehensive. The system might never provide opportunities to apply what she'd learned, but that didn't make her preparation less valuable or her capabilities less real. The Nevada night settled over Fairfield Air Base as Ella contemplated a future defined by other people's assumptions about her potential, wondering whether circumstances might someday prove those assumptions wrong. The emergency klaxon shattered the routine calm of Fairfield Air Base at 11:43, hours on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Ella was updating hydraulic fluid analysis reports in the maintenance office when the distinctive wailing sound sent personnel running toward their emergency stations. Through the window, she could see ground crews scrambling around the aircraft parking areas while vehicles raced toward the runway complex. Her radio crackled with fragments of urgent communication that painted a picture of developing catastrophe. Falcon 01 declaring emergency, hydraulic failure. Control problems. The transmission was broken and distorted, but Ella recognized the voice of Colonel Harrison calling for priority landing clearance. She dropped her paperwork and ran toward the flight line, arriving at the maintenance hangar just as Williams was coordinating the emergency response. Multiple screens displayed radar tracks and aircraft status information, showing Harrison's F-22 approaching the runway with critical system failures that threaten catastrophic loss of aircraft and pilot. "What's the situation?" Ella asked, though she could already interpret much of what she saw on the status displays. Williams looked grim as he monitored the radio communications. Harrison took a bird strike during low-level training. Multiple hydraulic systems are compromised, and he's lost significant flight control authority. The backup systems are functioning, but they're not providing adequate control response for normal landing procedures. Ella studied the system status displays, her extensive knowledge of F-22 hydraulics, allowing her to understand the severity of the situation better than most of the people in the room. The Raptor employed a complex fly-by-wire flight control system that depended on hydraulic pressure to move control surfaces. With multiple hydraulic systems damaged, the aircraft's computer was struggling to maintain stable flight characteristics. "Can he make a normal approach?" asked Captain Morrison, who had been monitoring the situation from the pilot briefing room. "Negative," Williams replied. "The aircraft is barely controllable in its current configuration. Harrison's trying to maintain level flight while we figure out emergency options." Through the radio static, Harrison's voice provided updates on his aircraft's condition. "Control response is severely degraded. I can maintain altitude, but directional control is marginal. Advising all personnel to prepare for possible ejection over unpopulated areas." Ella felt her stomach clench as she realized the implications. Harrison was one of the most experienced pilots on the base, with thousands of flight hours and extensive emergency training. If he was considering ejection, the aircraft was probably beyond recovery using conventional procedures. The maintenance teams began preparing for multiple scenarios: emergency landing support if Harrison could maintain control long enough to reach the runway, crash response if the aircraft went down short of the airfield, and post-ejection recovery if Harrison was forced to abandon the aircraft over the desert. "Falcon 01, the advised we're reviewing emergency procedures for your configuration," came the voice from the control tower. "Stand by for guidance on approach options." But Ella already knew what the emergency procedures manual would recommend for this situation. She'd memorized every system failure scenario and the corresponding recovery procedures. A hydraulic failure of this magnitude in an F-22 typically resulted in ejection and aircraft loss because the backup systems weren't designed to provide adequate control authority for safe landing approaches. Williams coordinated with base operations while Morrison and other pilots discussed potential solutions. Their conversation revealed the limited options available to Harrison. Attempt a high-speed straight-in approach that might result in runway overrun or loss of control. Try to reach a more suitable airfield with longer runways and better emergency facilities. Or eject over the desert and accept the loss of a $60 million aircraft. "The problem is control response," Morrison explained to the assembled group. "With degraded hydraulics, the flight control computers can't provide the precise inputs necessary for a stable approach. Harrison's probably fighting the aircraft just to maintain level flight." Ella listened to the discussion while studying the aircraft status displays, her mind racing through the emergency procedures she'd memorized and the system interactions she understood better than anyone else in the room. There was a potential solution that no one had mentioned, a procedure buried deep in the technical manuals that might allow recovery from this specific failure mode. "What about emergency flight control mode?" she asked quietly. Williams looked at her with surprise. "What?" "Emergency flight control mode," Ella repeated, her voice gaining confidence. "There's a backup system that bypasses the primary computers and provides direct pilot control over the hydraulic actuators. It's designed for exactly this kind of failure scenario." Morrison turned toward her with skepticism evident in his expression. "Johnson, that's not a procedure that maintenance personnel would know about. Emergency flight control mode requires specific pilot training and certification. I've studied the system extensively, Ella replied. The procedure involves reconfiguring the flight control computers to accept direct pilot inputs without computer interpretation. It gives the pilot manual control over individual control surfaces, but it requires precise understanding of aircraft aerodynamics and control coordination. Williams looked uncertain. Even if such a procedure exists, Harrison would need to know how to execute it. This isn't something you can explain over the radio to someone who's fighting to maintain aircraft control. Ella felt the familiar frustration of possessing knowledge that others couldn't accept because of her position and credentials. Sir, I could walk him through the procedure. I know every step of the reconfiguration process and the control techniques necessary for manual flight control. The room fell silent except for the continued radio chatter from Harrison's aircraft. Morrison stared at Ella with undisguised disbelief. You're suggesting that a maintenance technician could provide emergency flight instruction to an experienced test pilot? That's absurd. I'm suggesting that someone who's memorized every emergency procedure in the F-22 technical manual could provide information that might save both the pilot and the aircraft. Ella replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her. System. Williams grabbed the emergency procedures manual and began flipping through pages, looking for the procedure Ella had described. I don't see anything about emergency flight control mode in the standard emergency procedures. It's in section the 4th of July 12 of the Advanced Systems Manual, Ella said. The procedure was developed after several hydraulic failure incidents in early F-22 operations, but it's only included in the detailed technical documentation. As Williams searched for the referenced procedure, Harrison's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency. Control authority is deteriorating. I may need to eject within the next few minutes. Williams found the procedure buried in the Advanced Systems Manual, exactly where Ella had indicated, his finger tracing the complex technical instructions that outlined emergency flight control mode activation. His expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as he realized the depth of knowledge required to even locate this obscure emergency procedure, let alone understand its implementation. This is incredibly complex, Williams muttered, reading through the technical steps. The pilot has to reconfigure multiple computer systems while maintaining aircraft control. One mistake could make the situation worse. Morrison leaned over to examine the manual, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by growing concern. Harrison's been flying F-22s for 8 years, but I don't think anyone's actually practiced this procedure. It's theoretical emergency training that most pilots hope they'll never need. Ella stepped forward, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Sir, I've studied this procedure extensively. I understand every system interaction and every potential failure point. With permission, I could guide Colonel Harrison through the reconfiguration process. You want to talk an experienced pilot through an emergency procedure that you've never actually executed. Morrison's question carried a mixture of disbelief and desperation. I want to save Colonel Harrison's life and preserve a $60 million aircraft, Ella replied. The procedure is complex, but it's logically structured. Each step builds on the previous one, and the system responses are predictable if you understand the underlying engineering principles. Williams looked at the manual, then at Ella, then at the radio where Harrison's increasingly strained voice reported deteriorating aircraft control. Johnson, are you absolutely certain you understand this procedure well enough to guide someone through it under emergency conditions? Yes, sir. I've memorized every step and studied every system interaction. I know this procedure better than any pilot on this base because I've had time to analyze it theoretically without the pressure of actual emergency execution. The radio crackled with Harrison's voice, now carrying the tension of someone fighting to maintain control of a dying aircraft. Control authority is down to maybe 30%. I'm going to have to make a decision about ejection in the next 60 seconds. Morrison grabbed the radio microphone. Falcon 01, stand by. We may have a solution for your situation. Williams made the decision that would change everything. Johnson, get on the radio, walk him through it. Ella took the microphone with hands that were steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Her voice was calm, professional, and filled with confidence that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Colonel Harrison, this is Airman Johnson in maintenance control. I'm going to guide you through emergency flight control mode activation. This will give you direct manual control over the aircraft, but it requires precise execution of a multi-step reconfiguration procedure. Harrison's response carried a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Johnson, the maintenance technician, are you qualified to provide emergency flight instruction? Sir, I've studied this procedure extensively and understand every system interaction involved. With your permission, I can walk you through the steps necessary to regain control authority. There was a pause while Harrison processed this unexpected development. Through the radio, they could hear the strain in his voice as he fought to maintain level flight. Johnson, I'm running out of options here. If you think you can help, I'm willing to listen. Ella opened the manual to the emergency flight control mode procedure, though she could have recited every step from memory. Colonel, the first step is to access the backup flight control menu on your left multifunction display. You'll need to enter the emergency configuration code 7412. Copy, entering emergency configuration code. Harrison's voice reflected intense concentration as he worked through the cockpit procedures while simultaneously managing a barely controllable aircraft. Now you should see a menu with 4 options for flight control system reconfiguration. Select option 3, which is labeled Direct Control Interface. I see it. Selecting Direct Control Interface, there was a pause. The system is requesting confirmation for emergency mode activation. Ella consulted her mental checklist, visualizing the cockpit displays and system responses. Confirm the activation, but be prepared for a significant change in control feel. In direct control mode, your stick inputs will directly actuate the control surfaces without computer interpretation. You'll need to coordinate all control movements manually. Confirming emergency mode activation ... now. Harrison's voice carried a note of surprise. I'm getting improved control response. The aircraft feels different, but I can actually maintain directional control now. Williams and Morrison exchanged glances of amazement as they realized that Ella's guidance was actually working. The maintenance technician who had been dismissed as overly ambitious was successfully talking an experienced pilot through a complex emergency procedure that none of them had even known existed. Excellent, Colonel. Now you need to recalibrate your control inputs for manual flight. In this mode, the aircraft will respond exactly to your stick and rudder movements without computer assistance. Small inputs will produce significant responses. So start with very gentle control movements. Harrison's voice reflected growing confidence as he adapted to the new control system. Control authority is definitely improved. I can maintain altitude and heading much more effectively. Johnson, how did you know about this procedure? I've studied every emergency system in the F-22, sir. It's part of my preparation for providing comprehensive maintenance support. Morrison leaned toward the microphone. Falcon 01, do you feel confident attempting an approach in this configuration? Affirmative. Control response is adequate for approach and landing procedures. Johnson, I'm going to need continued guidance during the approach phase. Can you walk me through the specific control techniques for manual landing? Ella felt a surge of confidence as she realized her extensive preparation was finally finding practical application. Absolutely, sir. I'll guide you through every step of the approach and landing sequence. As Harrison began his emergency approach, guided by Ella's comprehensive knowledge of F-22 systems and emergency procedures, Everyone in the maintenance hangar realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A maintenance technician successfully providing emergency flight instruction to save both aircraft and pilot. The skepticism that had surrounded Ella's extensive studies was replaced by recognition that her inappropriate preparation had become the difference between catastrophic loss and successful recovery. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical anymore. It was saving lives and preserving military assets in real time. Williams watched in amazement as Ella calmly guided Harrison through the most challenging approach of his flying career. Her voice steady and professional as she provided the technical expertise that no one else in the room possessed. Despite the initial success of emergency flight control mode activation, the atmosphere in the maintenance hangar shifted when Colonel Bradley Steinberg, the base commander, arrived to assess the developing situation. Steinberg's presence brought additional authority figures, who quickly began questioning the unprecedented arrangement of having an enlisted maintenance technician provide emergency flight guidance to an experienced pilot. What exactly is happening here? Steinberg demanded, surveying the scene where Ella continued coaching Harrison through approach preparations while Williams and Morrison monitored system status displays. Williams stepped forward to explain. "Sir, we have a hydraulic emergency in progress." Airman Johnson identified an emergency procedure that restored control authority to the aircraft. She's currently providing guidance for approach and landing procedures. Steinberg's expression darkened as he processed this information. "You're telling me that a maintenance technician is providing flight instruction to Colonel Harrison? This is completely outside normal emergency procedures." "Sir, the situation required unconventional solutions," Morrison interjected. "Johnson's knowledge of the emergency flight control mode saved the aircraft from certain loss." "That's irrelevant," Steinberg replied sharply. "We have qualified flight instructors and emergency response personnel who should be handling this situation. Having an untrained enlisted person provide flight guidance creates liability issues and violates established protocols." Ella continued monitoring Harrison's approach while listening to the conversation developing behind her. She could hear the skepticism in Steinberg's voice and recognized the institutional resistance to accepting that someone outside the established hierarchy might possess critical knowledge. "Colonel Harrison, you're 3 miles from final approach." Ella transmitted. "Begin reducing power gradually while maintaining precise attitude control. In manual mode, the aircraft will require constant control inputs to maintain stable flight." "Copy, beginning approach sequence," Harrison replied. "Control response remains adequate for landing approach." Steinberg moved closer to Ella's position. "Airman Johnson, I want you to step back and let qualified personnel handle this emergency. This situation requires expertise that exceeds your training and qualifications." Ella felt the familiar frustration of having her capabilities dismissed based on her rank and role rather than her demonstrated competence. "Sir, I've successfully guided Colonel Harrison through the emergency procedure that restored control authority. Changing guidance personnel now could introduce confusion during a critical phase of flight. Your input was valuable for the initial emergency response," Steinberg acknowledged. "But approach and landing procedures require pilot-to-pilot communication. We're bringing in Major Collins from the Flight Training Division to complete the emergency guidance." Major Collins had just arrived in the hangar, having been summoned when word of the emergency reached the training squadron. He was an experienced instructor pilot with thousands of hours in various aircraft types, but Ella knew he had limited experience with F-22 emergency procedures and had probably never encountered emergency flight control mode. "What's the current status?" Collins asked, quickly reviewing the situation displays and emergency checklists. Morrison briefed him on the hydraulic failures and the emergency flight control mode activation. Johnson walked Harrison through the reconfiguration procedure. "The aircraft is now controllable, but it requires manual coordination of all flight controls," Collins nodded professionally. "I'll take over the emergency guidance from here. Harrison knows my voice, and I have experience with emergency approach procedures." Ella felt her heart sink as she realized her role in the emergency was being terminated, just as Harrison reached the most critical phase of his approach. She'd guided him through the complex system reconfiguration, but others would receive credit for completing the successful recovery. "Colonel Harrison, this is Major Collins in base operations," Collins transmitted. "I'm taking over emergency guidance for your approach and landing." Harrison's response carried a note of confusion. "Collins, Johnson has been doing an excellent job guiding me through this procedure. She understands the emergency flight control system better than anyone I've worked with. I understand that, Falcon 01, but we need to follow proper emergency protocols. Johnson isn't qualified to provide approach guidance for your situation." Ella watched helplessly as Collins began reviewing emergency procedures that he was learning in real time, while Harrison flew an approach that required immediate, knowledgeable guidance. Collins was a competent pilot, but he lacked the detailed understanding of emergency flight control mode that Ella had developed through months of intensive study. "Falcon 01, begin final approach descent," Collins instructed. "Maintain standard approach airspeeds and descent rates." Ella's technical knowledge told her immediately that this guidance was inappropriate for manual flight control mode. Standard approach procedures assumed computer-assisted flight controls that could automatically coordinate control surface movements. Manual mode required different techniques and airspeed management. "Major Collins," Ella interjected quietly. "In manual mode, standard approach speeds are too fast. The pilot needs to fly at reduced airspeeds with higher angle of attack to maintain control effectiveness." Collins glanced at her with irritation. "Johnson, I'm handling this emergency now. Please step back and let me do my job." Through the radio, Harrison's voice carried increasing strain as he attempted to follow Collins' guidance. "Having some difficulty maintaining approach path. Control inputs aren't producing expected responses." Ella realized that Harrison was struggling because Collins was providing guidance based on normal flight control procedures rather than the unique requirements of emergency manual mode. Her extensive preparation had given her understanding of these specialized techniques, but she was being prevented from sharing that knowledge during the most critical moments. Steinberg placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Airman Johnson, you've made your contribution to this emergency. Now let the qualified personnel complete the job." As Ella stepped back from the radio, she watched Collins struggle to provide appropriate guidance for a situation he didn't fully understand, while Harrison fought to control an aircraft using techniques that no one else in the room had studied as extensively as she had. The dismissal was complete. Her expertise was acknowledged but deemed insufficient, her knowledge valuable but inappropriate, her contribution significant but ultimately replaceable by personnel with proper credentials and authority. Harrison's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency as Collins continued providing guidance that was inappropriate for manual flight control mode. "Base operations, I'm having significant difficulty maintaining approach path. The aircraft is not responding to standard control inputs." Ella watched Collins frantically flip through emergency procedure manuals, searching for information about manual flight control techniques that simply wasn't included in standard pilot training materials. His well-intentioned guidance was based on normal flight procedures that didn't apply to Harrison's current situation. "Falcon 01, try increasing your approach speed," Collins transmitted. "Additional airspeed should improve control authority." Ella's technical knowledge told her this recommendation was exactly wrong for manual mode operations. Higher airspeeds would actually reduce control effectiveness and make the aircraft more difficult to manage during the final approach phase. She could see Harrison was heading toward a dangerous situation that might result in loss of both aircraft and pilot. "Major Collins," she said quietly, Increasing airspeed in manual mode will make the control problems worse. The pilot needs to fly slower, not faster. Collins shot her an irritated look. Johnson, I told you to step back. I'm the qualified instructor pilot here. Through the radio, Harrison's voice reflected growing desperation. Control authority is decreasing. I may need to execute a go-around and attempt ejection over the desert. Ella realized that her choice was becoming clear. She could follow orders and watch Harrison crash, or she could act on her knowledge and potentially save his life. The consequences of insubordination would be severe, but the consequences of inaction would be irreversible. Steinberg was monitoring multiple communication channels while Collins continued his ineffective guidance. Morrison stood nearby, his expression reflecting growing concern about the deteriorating situation. Williams watched Ella with a mixture of sympathy and warning, understanding her frustration but recognizing the impossibility of her position. Falcon 1. Maintain current approach speed, Collins transmitted. We're reviewing additional options for your situation. But Ella knew there were no additional options in the manuals Collins was consulting. The specialized knowledge needed to guide Harrison safely to the ground existed in her memory, developed through months of intensive study that everyone had dismissed as inappropriate ambition. She made her decision. Stepping forward to the backup radio station, Ella keyed the microphone on a secondary frequency that she knew Harrison monitored. Colonel Harrison, this is Johnson on auxiliary frequency. Switch to channel 7 for guidance that might save your life. Collins spun around in surprise. Johnson, what are you doing? Get away from that radio immediately. Steinberg moved toward her position, his face flushed with anger. Airman Johnson, you're relieved of duty. Step away from all communication equipment immediately. But Ella had already switched frequencies and was transmitting to Harrison on the auxiliary channel. Colonel, in manual mode, you need to fly at much slower airspeeds with higher angle of attack. Reduce your approach speed to 140 knots and maintain precise attitude control with small, coordinated inputs. Harrison's voice came back immediately on the new frequency. Johnson, thank God. Collins' guidance wasn't working. Reducing speed to 140 knots. That's perfect. Sir, now you should feel improved control authority. The key in manual mode is to fly the aircraft like a vintage fighter from World War II. More pilot input, less computer assistance. Steinberg reached Ella's position and attempted to take the microphone from her hands. Airman Johnson, you are directly disobeying orders. Release that microphone immediately. Ella held onto the radio with determination that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Sir, Colonel Harrison's life is in danger. I have the knowledge to save him, and I'm not going to let him die because of protocol concerns. This is insubordination, Johnson. You're ending your military career. Then I'm ending it by saving a pilot's life, Ella replied, continuing her transmission to Harrison. Colonel, you should be feeling much better control response now. Begin your descent to final approach altitude using gentle coordinated control inputs. Williams stepped between Ella and Steinberg, his voice calm but firm. Sir, Johnson's guidance is working. Harrison's flight path is stabilizing. Morrison monitored the auxiliary frequency, his expression reflecting amazement at Harrison's improved aircraft control. She's right. Whatever Johnson's telling him is working better than our standard procedures. Through the radio, Harrison's voice carried renewed confidence. Control authority is much improved. Johnson, this feels completely different from standard approaches, but the aircraft is responding predictably now. Steinberg faced a command decision that would determine whether to allow an insubordinate enlisted person to continue providing guidance that was clearly working, or to enforce discipline at the risk of losing both aircraft and pilot. Collins stood nearby, his emergency manuals open, but obviously inadequate for the situation they were facing. His expertise was valuable for normal flight operations, but Ella's specialized knowledge was proving essential for this unique emergency scenario. "Colonel Harrison," Ella continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around her, "you're doing perfectly. Continue your approach at current airspeed and attitude. I'll guide you through the landing sequence step by step." As Harrison's aircraft stabilized on final approach under Ella's guidance, everyone in the maintenance hangar realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. An enlisted maintenance technician, defying direct orders to provide life-saving emergency flight instruction that no one else possessed. The choice to act had been made, and there was no turning back. With Harrison's aircraft stabilized on final approach under Ella's guidance, the maintenance hangar became a tense battleground between protocol and results. Steinberg stood with his hand extended toward the microphone, torn between enforcing discipline and acknowledging that Ella's insubordinate actions were working better than authorized procedures. "Colonel Harrison, you're 2 miles from touchdown," Ella transmitted, her voice calm despite the career-ending confrontation developing around her. In manual mode, the landing phase requires precise coordination between throttle and stick inputs. Unlike computer-assisted landings, you'll need to actively fly the aircraft all the way to the ground. Morrison monitored Harrison's flight path on the approach radar, calling out updates that confirmed Ella's guidance was producing textbook approach parameters. On glide path, on centerline, airspeed stable at 140 knots. Whatever she's telling him is working perfectly. Collins attempted to regain control of the situation by switching to Harrison's primary radio frequency. "Falcon 01, this is base operations. Return to primary frequency for official emergency guidance." Harrison's response was immediate and decisive. "Negative base ops. Johnson's instructions are working. I'm staying with her guidance until I'm safely on the ground." Steinberg's expression reflected the impossible position he faced. An experienced pilot was refusing official guidance in favor of instructions from an insubordinate enlisted technician, but those unauthorized instructions were clearly superior to established procedures. "Johnson, you realize you're destroying your military career," Steinberg said quietly, his anger replaced by reluctant recognition of her effectiveness. "Sir, I'd rather destroy my career than watch Colonel Harrison die because I was too afraid to use what I know," Ella replied, never taking her eyes off the approach displays that showed Harrison's steady progress toward the runway. Williams made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Colonel Steinberg, request permission to officially transfer emergency guidance authority to Airman Johnson. She demonstrably understands this situation better than anyone else present." "That's completely outside regulation," Steinberg replied. "Emergency flight instruction must be provided by qualified pilots, not maintenance personnel." "With respect, sir," Morrison interjected, "regulations assume that qualified pilots have the necessary knowledge for unusual emergency situations. In this case, Johnson's specialized preparation makes her more qualified than anyone else to handle this specific emergency." Through the radio, Harrison provided real-time confirmation of Ella's effectiveness. "Johnson, the aircraft is handling beautifully under your guidance. Control response is predictable, and I have complete confidence in landing safely." Ella continued her methodical coaching, drawing on months of study that no one had valued until this moment. "Colonel, you're 1 mile from touchdown. Begin reducing power gradually while maintaining attitude with slight back pressure on the stick. In manual mode, the aircraft will want to pitch down as you reduce power, so you'll need to compensate with elevator input. Copy, reducing power and maintaining attitude. The aircraft feels stable and controllable." Collins stepped back from his emergency manuals, his professional pride struggling with the obvious reality that his training hadn't prepared him for this situation. "I've never seen emergency procedures this detailed. Where did Johnson learn these techniques?" "She's been studying F-22 systems for months," Williams replied. Everyone thought her research was excessive, but apparently she was preparing for exactly this kind of situation. Steinberg watched the approach displays showing Harrison's perfect flight path, guided by unauthorized instructions from a maintenance technician who was violating direct orders to provide that guidance. The command decision he faced would set precedent for how the military valued actual competence versus formal credentials. "Airman Johnson," Steinberg said finally, "if you successfully guide Colonel Harrison to a safe landing, we'll address your insubordination afterward. If you fail, you'll be responsible for both his death and the loss of a strategic military asset." Ella felt the weight of that responsibility, but her extensive preparation had built confidence in her knowledge and abilities. "I understand, sir. Colonel Harrison will land safely." "Johnson, I'm on short final now," Harrison transmitted. "Talk me through the touchdown and rollout procedures." "Perfect, Colonel." "At 50 feet above the runway, begin your landing flare by gradually pulling back on the stick while simultaneously reducing power to idle. The key is coordinating these inputs smoothly. Too much flare will cause a hard landing. Too little will result in a nose wheel first touchdown." Harrison's voice reflected intense concentration. "Beginning flare. Power to idle ... holding attitude." Everyone in the maintenance hangar watched the external cameras, showing Harrison's F-22 approaching the runway in a perfect landing attitude, guided by instructions from someone they'd dismissed as overly ambitious just hours earlier. "Touchdown in 3.2.1. Contact." Harrison's voice carried relief and amazement. "Smooth touchdown, rollout normal. Johnson, that was one of the best emergency landings I've ever made." The hangar erupted in cheers and applause as Harrison's aircraft rolled safely down the runway, but Ella felt only quiet satisfaction that her preparation had found its ultimate test and proved sufficient to save both aircraft and pilot. Steinberg approached her position, his expression unreadable. "Airman Johnson, you've successfully completed an unauthorized emergency instruction that saved both pilot and aircraft. You've also committed serious insubordination that normally results in court-martial and discharge." "Yes, sir." "I understand the consequences, do you? Because I'm not sure you understand what you've actually accomplished here today." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.